You're ready to start this second appointment with coming soon. A series of online talks with the protagonists of the next exhibition season of Fondazione Modena Arti Visive. This evening, we are glad to welcome as our guest the Northern Irish Willie Doherty, an artist to which the FMAV will dedicate in November the first personal exhibition in an Italian institution to be held in the premises of Palazzina dei Giardini. The title of the exhibition is Where? Dove? A double language title because it is an exhibition co-produced by FMAV together with the Museum of Belfast, belonging to the National Northern Irish Museums. In February 2021, the exhibition will take place and is supported by the prestigious British Council within the 2020 UK-Italy cultural season that will take place in fall 2020 in Modena and other cities in Italy. The title of the exhibition is Being Present, Esserci. The title was decided last year, but it is very much actual. Willie Doherty has been a protagonist of some of the most prestigious international art institutions, among which Tate Liverpool, Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris, and the Appel in Amsterdam, as well as the Irish Museum of Modern Art, Dublin, Kunstverein in München. Doherty in 2007 represented Northern Ireland on occasion of the 52nd Venice Biennale and also took part in Documenta Casso, Manifesta and Sao Paulo and Istanbul Biennale. Twice he has been a finalist of the Turner Prize. Willie Doherty is an artist that since from the 80s has used photographies and videos as well as films in an extremely innovative way, nurturing and increasing progressively a higher and higher ability to involve and seduce the observer, the viewer. And he actually traps psychologically the viewer and forces him or her to tackle thorny questions and thorny issues. The works by Doherty are tightly linked with his origins. He was born in Derry, in Northern Ireland, a city that is divided from its very name. A part of its inhabitants called the city Derry, another part called the city Londonderry. And his work stem out of the real actual facts and the heritage of troubles. Ireland, Northern Ireland, since from the beginning of the 70s and the 90s has been a stage of conflicts with traces till today. In spite of this local rooting, the activity of Doherty touches upon universal topics, and one of these is the topic of borders, around which this exhibition in Modena and Belfast will revolve. To help this conversation come to life with me, I have Anne Stewart, Senior Curator of the Art of Ulster Museum in Belfast. I'm honored to work with her, and I would like to greet her and thank her. Without further ado, let's move to a whole series of questions we would like to ask to Willie Doherty. And I would like to remind our audience that later on, they might also ask questions. So if you click on the button raise hand, you can, let's say, book yourself to ask questions to the artist. Let's begin then with a topic I find extremely interesting, a core topic, a controversy actually, very much
per tutti i nostri
debated
progressi.
nowadays in terms of
Molto
photography,
dibattuto
meaning
riguardo
the
alla
importance of
fotografia è quello
photojournalism to tell
dell'importanza del
facts.
fotogiornalismo per
At the same
raccontare i
time,
fatti
the limits
e
of
al tempo stesso però ai
photojournalism to
suoi limiti,
understand
perché
the
il
complexity of
fotogiornalismo deve
reality
comprendere a
is there.
fondo la complessità della
Many
realtà.
reporters feel
Molti
that their
reporter
job is a
infatti
mission,
sentono il
but
proprio lavoro come una
different
missione,
artists
ma ci sono
have
anche diversi
given
artisti
up
che hanno
photojournalism to
abbandonato il
explore
fotogiornalismo per
images in
esplorare
this
il ruolo delle
information
immagini
society.
nella
Your work
società
has a lot to do with
dell'informazione.
this, Willie, but
Il
yours
tuo
is a
lavoro,
different
Willie, ha molto a che
story.
fare con
You
tutto
have
questo, però
gained this
la tua è
awareness
tutta una
from a
storia
direct
un po'
experience
diversa, è
and
maturata
have
questa
always dealt
consapevolezza da un'esperienza
um,
diretta di vita che è quella,
with
poi magari ce lo dirai, a cui dà
unfortunately
vita il
sad events
romanzo
such
e
as the Bloody
tristemente
Sunday
noto Bloody Sunday proprio di
attack.
David.
And then you
Successivamente
filtered
l'hai
this experience
filtrata
through an
nel tuo lavoro
artistic use of the
artistico,
video and
basato
photographic
appunto sulla
medium.
fotografia
So I
e
was
sulle immagini
wondering,
audiovisive.
can you tell us more
Mi
about it?
interessava chiederti se ci
Because
puoi
I believe
dire
this
qualcosa
topic
di
is
più su
core to
questo
your
tema che
practice.
appunto credo sia centrale nella tua pratica.
Yes, my practice does have a relationship with photojournalism, but it's not directly informed or shaped by this practice per se, but more by my experience of seeing how photojournalism depicted the events that were happening around me in the 1970s and 80s, growing up in Derry in Northern Ireland. So in some ways, my interest in photojournalism, as you said already, really is in the limitations of photojournalism and to some extent the limitations of photography itself. So I thought it might be, interesting to have a look at a few images here that are in some ways very typical of the kind of photojournalism that was used to cover the events in Ireland in the early 1970s. So we're looking at a couple of images by Don McCullen. This image is by Gil Perez. And I mean, these photographers, and this is Bruno Barbie. These photographers invariably visited Northern Ireland on assignment for maybe a few days, maybe a little longer. And they made some of the most well-known and some of the most arresting images that describe the conflict. In some ways, I became very conscious of the limitations of this and how the coverage of Northern Ireland was subject to some very familiar tropes of war photography that we've just seen: troops on the street, rioters, barricades, barbed wire, children and women juxtaposed near crouching soldiers who are aiming their rifles. So it seemed to me that this was in some ways unhelpful at some level in describing the complexity of the situation there. And as I say, it became reduced to a repetition of some very familiar kind of tropes around what a certain kind of photography looks like and what it does. So as a young artist living and working in this place, I in some ways became frustrated that these were the images that were best known of the place where I lived. And so in some ways my early works in the 1980s are a reaction against photojournalism, but in some ways they also are indebted to photojournalism in the sense that I was interested in making photographs of a place, of actual events, and in responding to those in some way. But I did evolve a very different kind of strategy to deal with that. So I decided that I wouldn't foreground the kind of things that we've just seen in these photographs. But I became more interested in finding a different kind of pace, a different way of talking about the experience of living up and growing through that time. Because the fact of the matter is that, you know, most days were not like that. Most days didn't have these dramatic events. So to some extent, the conflict was often largely invisible. The days were filled by a different kind of dynamic. But however, the tension was always quite palpable. And there was a sense of fear, anxiety, apprehension, and mistrust to some extent. So I became more interested in the possibility of trying to construct a language for myself that avoided these kinds of images, but tried to get closer to some of the work that I was interested in that I'd seen through artists working with conceptualism and the use of image and text. So these became, in many ways, more important areas of concern for me rather than photojournalism itself. And in some ways, perhaps, you know, if I can use Jeff Wall's term, near documentary, I mean, that became something that I became interested in, or this idea of the documentary effect rather than documentary itself. And I think you have an image here of border incident, and if we can perhaps look at that. Yeah, this was a work that I made in 1993 or 94, and in some ways, this was the start of a series of works that became interested in the idea of the aftermath of an event or an incident, where I didn't know what happened, but I could speculate about how this car ended up on a border road, burnt out. But I was also interested in the idea that the burnt out car was in some ways a kind of spectacle, a signifier of terrorism, and at the same time, kind of redundant, you know, a kind of useless image that really doesn't tell you very much, but tells you specific kinds of information, but doesn't offer a lot about context. So I was interested in that tension between what this image could possibly do and how this image is also restricted or limited in terms of how the viewer may understand it. I remember at the time that I was making these works, the Italian knitwear company Benetton at that time were running a series of, I suppose, controversial or provocative advertisements, and they used an image of an exploding car, a kind of a car bomb, in one of their campaigns, which really kind of struck me as a kind of an interesting interface between a kind of photojournalism, advertising, and spectacle. And I was kind of interested in this combination of how images can exist in the world outside of the strict parameters of photojournalism, but having this more complex life somewhere between reportage, performance, reconstruction, staging, and the ability to just find something like this after the event. So in some ways it's, in terms of the experience of time, removed from the event, and it exists in this strange other space. So it's a long-winded answer, but in some ways, my relationship with with photojournalism is ongoing, and I really love looking at other photographers' work, and some of the images that I've shown from Gil Perez and Don McCullen are incredible images, but I also question the value of those images. I question the way in which our relationship with photojournalism has changed and evolved. I think it's probably not as easy now to think of photojournalism as, or these photographers as being somehow impartial witnesses who are present at events somehow on our behalf, and who we trust, or at that time certainly there was this kind of notion that the photographer was a kind of a reliable witness in some way. So I think all of those ideas of truth, of reliability, of the photographer as being in some ways impartial, have gone. Those ideas have largely evaporated. Our relationship with photography is much more open-ended, much more complicated, and I think we are much more inclined to question the validity of any image now, rather than seek a degree of comfort or reassurance in the photographic image.
Ora
I'd like
vorrei passare la
to give
parola
the
a
floor
Anne,
to Anne.
che saluto e
Thank you, Anne, for
ringrazio di
being with
nuovo.
us.
Thank you. That
Hello,
was hello. A wonderful answer, and
Stupenda.
absolutely. My next question is about margins, and it goes back a little to what you were saying about the days when not very much was happening, but the sense of living through days which were not in the news. And I wanted to ask about the use of margins or marginal areas in your work. And in fact, it's two questions, because I want to go back to your earliest practice, where often in your work there's a concentration and focus on the meeting of resistant forces. And by margins, I'm referring to places where these meetings occur. And in your use of landscape in particular, the potency of the image is intensified by the sense that we are observing a marginal place where events and perceptions have created a tension and an unease that is insistent and disturbing. This is a very general question, but I'd like to ask what first drew you to the idea of using marginal spaces in this way, and then just to add that perhaps in the light of our recent experience of the coronavirus pandemic, you might like to add something about your experience of the past few months, where we've lived through areas of unexpected boundaries where none existed before, and wondered about your thoughts on these new social restrictions. So that's a rather long question, but it's going back to your earliest practice.
Yeah, well, I'll start from there then, because I think my interest in these kind of marginal or liminal spaces, again, was formed by my experience of living in Derry. I mean, as Daniele said, Derry is a place with two names, Derry and Londonderry. One is the Anglicisation of the Gaelic name, and Londonderry is the colonial name of the city. So it's a city that's also divided by a river, so it has a geographical border in some ways. It is very close to the border with the Irish Republic. So for me, I suppose my interest in the landscape and in these marginal places around the city, close to the border and other locations, stem from an interest in trying to make sense of what was happening around me. I mean, I've already kind of said that my interest didn't really lie in the possibility or the potential of using photojournalism to do that job. So I became more interested in looking at the landscape, and I thought of the landscape, and I suppose the terrain is an expression that I use, which in some ways has a more kind of military connotations. The terrain has been this place as being somewhere where certain types of tectonic plates, and but by that I mean the tectonic plates of history and of politics meet. And in the kind of tension that creates, it struck me that this was a place where a lot of those issues that you mentioned there, in terms of how these forces come together, seem to be encapsulated or found in this one small place. And in some ways, the geography of the place exposed those tensions and those issues very clearly for me. So in some ways, to use the landscape became a way of me being able to articulate some of those issues that would have been difficult to describe otherwise. So for me, these marginal places became the places where these forces were exposed or laid bare. And I felt very much that the impact of history, the impact of politics, was very much etched onto the landscape itself in the same way. So that became something that I suppose very quickly became one of the core tenets of the work. I mean, that was a principle that I kind of was able to use to kind of make sense of what was happening around me, you know. I think you showed an image there just briefly, and the image came on the screen there of a still from the video work Remains, which is an example of another kind of marginal space within the city itself. And this was a place that I knew from the 1970s, when as a teenager I used to kind of hang around this place. And I knew at that time that this place was one of those occasions that was used for kneecapping, this practice where people are shot in the back of the knees as a form of punishment shooting for some kind of antisocial behavior. And I returned to this place in 2013 to make this video work Remains, because the year before that, in 2012, two young boys were also kneecapped in the same place. So this was a practice that had been obviously carrying on for a number of decades through families, and kind of, so there's this perpetuation of this kind of intergenerational violence, and often carried out in these kind of marginal spaces within the city, places that are kind of largely invisible but are kind of notorious in some way. So for many reasons, I was both aware of these spaces as being places where the kind of sharp end of the violence, if you want, was often carried out, but also that these marginal spaces, and I'm thinking particularly around the border area, and I know we'll talk about that further in the conversation, that these places were places where these larger forces were made visible and were played out. So for all of those reasons, you know, I was attracted, if that's the right word, to work in these kinds of locations and to kind of find them out. And also because these places are usually the sorts of places that don't get photographed, that don't become part of the story of a place, that are not the usual places where reporters end up going, because, you know, largely nothing happens there, and the events that do happen there happen in a way that is kind of unspectacular and probably not really very photogenic. But somehow I'm kind of more interested in those places that that don't have anything dramatic happening, where it looks as if nothing could happen or nothing might happen, and they appear to be overlooked in some way. So the other part of your question, I think, was about the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on our experience of living with boundaries. You know, I mean, like everyone else, I mean, I've spent the last couple of months in a degree of isolation, yeah, I mean, I think it's been strange but informative in terms of how we think of the world, how we negotiate the world, and how we think of the spaces that we can occupy. So I think that ability of to kind of travel, to cross borders. I mean, I live very close to the border here, so I can cross the border within 10 or 15 minutes. But also just to be restricted to the confines of one's home forms another kind of border. So, but aside from those physical and geographical restrictions and limitations, I mean, I think what's been interesting about this whole period is the kind of mental border that we arrange for ourselves. You know, that and I think it's interesting that by and large, most people were compliant with the instruction to stay at home. And I know for me that the experience of staying at home created a kind of different kind of experience of time. My experience of the month of April was that it seemed to last forever. It was kind of my experience of time from day to day was very slow, almost like being a child again in some way, you know. And then May disappeared very quickly. So so yeah, I mean, it's interesting that we can adapt to kind of live within certain kinds of limitations, but and I'm interested in how we kind of use the imagination to imagine what's happening outside of where we are, and to construct another sense of how we negotiate and kind of exist in the world. I mean, I was also trying to keep myself busy doing some work at that time, but it is an interesting experience that is akin in some ways to living close to a border, where you understand that there are a kind of set of rules somehow that permit your access, your ability to cross that border or not cross it, and again in that kind of situation, we find ourselves being largely compliant with the rules and how those restrict our movements. So in some ways, I guess I grew up with that experience of feeling the presence of a border, of feeling the presence of restrictions, and I suppose to some extent one of my preoccupations in this work that I was making with the photography in the mid 80s and early 90s was to kind of try to go to places where I wasn't supposed to be. So I would try to cross the border by foot using roads that were designated as unapproved or had been closed by roadblocks. So I guess I just wanted to see what it was like to be on the road where you were not supposed to be on, rather than be on the road that you had permission to be on.
Exactly. Well, that's been so interesting, because in a sense it was, you're describing restrictions that we couldn't have imagined just months before, and I think at this point, it's Daniele, it's your question about the landscape. So we're going back to that idea of just your sense of place and being in the place and how it can be altered by different perceptions. So
yeah, I mean, just to finish that, I mean, to say something about that sense of how things can change very quickly. I mean, I remember in 1994, after the first IRA ceasefire, within a few weeks of that, John Major, who was the British Prime Minister at the time, declared that all of these border roads, these concrete roadblocks that dotted the landscape between the north and south of Ireland could be opened. You know, so it was a very clear example and kind of indication of how these restrictions that had been in place for like all of my adult life at that point could be removed at the request of politics.
exactly.
You know, so in some ways that this idea that these things were permanent and that was how the border existed and that was how one's relationship with this place was defined, changed in a matter of days.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of very kind of wonderful example of how politics and our ability to affect change in politics can have these very immediate effects on the way that we can live our life. But I guess the reverse is true. If they can be removed in a few days, they can also be put back in a few days. And I think that that's something that has become very clear in the last number of years as our relationship with borders internationally has changed, and we've become very aware of how movement can be restricted as easily as it can be permitted. So yeah, I mean, it's another kind of crazy example of how these restrictions and limitations and barriers can be removed and can be replaced quite as easily.
Interessantissimo.
Well, I do find extremely interesting what you just said about the landscape. Also, various topics have been already touched upon so far. Particularly, we talked about margins and boundaries, but as said, the exhibition where, dove, is going to be focused on boundaries. You were born in Derry, Northern Ireland, and currently you live in Donegal, which is in the Republic of Ireland, next to the borders with the UK. I was interested in knowing what this over the year represented for you, what this border represented for you. You tried to evoke the presence of ghosts from the past, hunting these areas nowadays. And by the way, in English, you have a beautiful word, which is haunt, to haunt, which has no equivalent in Italian language. You did that in spite of the fact that over the last year it was possible to cross the border freely. Now the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union opens the prospect of a return, possibly, to a true border, with a whole series of consequences. So how are you experiencing this situation? And is this going to be the scenario of the new film you're going to present on purpose in this exhibition?
Yeah. I mean, the situation with Brexit is still quite volatile, I think. The UK appears to be determined to leave the EU at the end of this year. So it doesn't look as if there will be any kind of extension. So it's possible that the UK could leave EU without a customs agreement in place, which would potentially change the way in which the border functions between North and South of Ireland. So that would have quite a big impact here. Yeah, I mean, it's possible that the border in Ireland could become collateral damage in the way in which these negotiations might unravel over the next number of months. So in a way, we have to kind of wait and see what happens with that. But as I said earlier, I mean, the border has figured to a great extent in the work that I've made over the last number of years, and I think particularly since the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, I've been kind of interested in not just borders in relation to that, but also this idea of looking at the past. And you mentioned my use of ghosts, and the idea of haunting and of the landscape containing traces of some of the trauma of the past. This is an image from Ghost Story, which is the work that I made for the Venice Biennale in 2007, and we will show this work as part of the exhibition in Modena and also in Belfast. This work is part of the collection of the Ulster Museum, which I'm very proud of, and so it will be fantastic to have the opportunity to show this work again. But in this work, the narrator, if you want, speculates about how some of the traumatic events of the past that have not been resolved or dealt with continue to be present. And I suppose I use the image or the idea of a spectral presence, and the idea of a haunting to evoke the way in which these things that are intangible, unreal, may be present within the landscape. I remember reading a number of years ago an interview with a woman whose husband had been shot in a picturesque wooded area outside of Derry, and her saying that she couldn't ever pass by this place without thinking about what had happened there. And I think this is true for many people who have experienced different traumas, that the connection with landscape, the connection with a particular place triggers memories of that trauma. So in some ways, the work that I've made in the last number of years has attempted to address this in some way. I think this idea, or this issue of how we have dealt with the past in the peace process in Northern Ireland has been very problematic. There has never been a formal or official mechanism for allowing people to discuss their experiences, to confront the protagonist of a crime that they may be a victim of, or their family may be a victim of. So in many ways, we have been asked to indulge in a kind of amnesia about the past, to pretend that somehow it didn't happen because it's difficult to deal with, and that we've been asked to forget about the past and move forward to look at a better future. But I think the past has a has a nasty habit of coming back to bite us when we don't deal with it and when we least expect it. So in some ways, the work that I've made using the landscape as a kind of vehicle for this idea that there is something embedded within the landscape itself has been a feature of a number of works over the last number of years, and in some ways is goes back to some of my earlier kind of works and thoughts about the landscape, where I'm interested in what is kind of hidden or what is invisible within a landscape. So, you know, when one looks at an image of a view, it's possible to deal with what you see in terms of the view presented by the photographer, the image presented by the photographer, or it's possible to think about what you can't see. You know, what history, what trauma lies within the landscape that is not immediately visible within the image. I think this is something that that perhaps we want to deal with as a topic or a subject within the exhibition as well.
Indeed, we will do that. It's going to be possible to look at your new video installation, your new film that will revolve around these topics, as far as I understand. Over the last days, actually, your new film, was broadcasted online, and we talked about this with Anne Stewart. She's been following your activity for a number of years now, and she was extremely struck by this video. Therefore, I would like to ask her to talk about this work. What were your impressions about it?
I think we're going to see a clip first, 2 minutes of the new film. Your new film, Endless, was shot in Derry in March 2020, really just before the COVID-19 lockdown was announced. And it's the first film that you've launched online, so it's a completely new way of presenting work and a completely new way for us to experience it. The work is available to be seen in the Kerlin Gallery viewing room until the 16th of June, and it was made in collaboration with your galleries, Alexandra and Bonin in New York and Peter Kleikman in Zurich and the Kerlin Gallery in Dublin. So this is the clip now of the first 2 minutes of the film.
As a child, I was always prone to exaggeration, fond of making up stories. I see myself sitting on the cold, dark stairs, shivering. Laughter, muffled voices from below. Banished in shame. A liar. The tears, the cries of injustice. Now I'm lost to the world, in the place where lost bodies lie, narrow enough, deep enough, sufficient for a body. Among the little dams of twigs and brown leaves that gather in the dark cavities, waiting in the gloom, dead still, the end of all. I believe that God could see me. At some level, I still believe that he can look into my soul and see who I really am. Nowhere to hide. Not under the cloak of darkness, not in the shadows of bright sunshine, not behind closed eyes. He can see underneath everything. He can see inside everything. I know, and he knows that my soul is tainted by sin.
So yeah, this is something that I was doing during lockdown. So I wasn't only thinking about how long the days were, because I spent a lot of days editing.
In many ways, what Daniele has just said is that I feel very strongly that Endless marks a very powerful new direction in your work, and I'd like to ask you about that.
I was always prone to exaggerate.
The psychological insight suggested by speaking or thinking figure is rare in your work, and so it's a great import when it does appear. In much of your work, the human presence is palpable, but also absent, and the viewer is left to piece together the traces of recent events or a more distant past while being challenged to question their own perceptions and interpretations. So, given the complexity of your practice, there is a sense that when a figure does appear, it will provide some explanation or possibly even answers. But instead, I always feel, and it's clear, that your figures have an unnerving and disquieting presence, and they raise questions and hint at many possible answers. And I would even say that they have a role almost as oracles, in that their speech is obscure and can produce different readings and interpretations. And in Endless, which is very powerfully shot in monochrome black and white, the figure actually speaks, and there's a sense of narrative and psychological insight offered by his stories. So I wanted to ask if you do feel that this is a new direction in your work, and your thoughts about that.
Well, it is new in the sense that you describe, Anne, that this is the first time that I've worked with an actor who speaks on camera. A lot of the work that I have made in the past used the human voice in voiceover. But I really felt that this work needed to have the presence of a speaking figure. But I agree with you. I mean, he still exists as something of a kind of a cipher, and the work it is connected to other works that I've made in the past, where I have used a figure in the work. For example, Non-Specific Threat, which used a male figure, and Closure, which used a female figure. And I think the origin of these works goes back a little further, and actually it was developed out of my black and white photographs with text. When in 1990 I made a work called Same Difference, and then the year after a work called They're All the Same. And both of these works were made in response to the broadcast media ban, which was a ban that was put in place by the British government in 1989. The purpose of which was to restrict the voices of Sinn Féin, which is the political party of the IRA, and a number of other proscribed organizations from television and radio broadcasts. So essentially an act of censorship, which had a strange effect also in that it created an air of censorship that was felt by writers and authors, poets, and not just journalists. and also artists like myself. So in some ways, the work that I've made that used the human voice from that time has always been interested in giving voice to something that was unheard, either for political reasons or that was unwelcome in some way or difficult in some way. So Non-Specific Threat in some ways was a work that was made in the lead up to the war in Iraq, and a lot of the language that was used around trying to define kind of terrorism against the backdrop of this kind of war against terror. So in Endless, this figure is equally kind of unsympathetic character in a way, and that it is kind of revealed that he is some kind of informer or agent, and that our relationship with him is kind of slightly ambiguous because of that, because he's someone who confesses, if you want, or portrays himself as a liar, as being disreputable in some way, of being untrustworthy. So in a way, the character voices many of the kind of underlying anxieties that kind of exist in somewhere like Northern Ireland with its kind of history, and also expresses a degree of trauma as well, I think, in the way in which he speaks about his own experience, both as a child, but also as an adult, in terms of some of the decisions that he makes. And he also, and I suppose this is another aspect of the work that I wanted to evoke, the way in which lying, if you want, or a certain economy with the truth has become deeply embedded within mainstream politics now. So, you know, again, our kind of relationship with the truth is once again kind of under attack, where, you know, we now have the presence of something known as kind of alternative facts, you know. So yeah, the work attempts to kind of deal with a lot of these kind of issues that are, I guess, they feel contemporary, but in the context of somewhere like Northern Ireland, they also feel historical. But again, there are things that have never properly been acknowledged or dealt with.
Either my next question, which actually relates to Ghost Story, which is the still of the work you made for 2007 Venice Biennale that we looked at a moment ago. So we can maybe come back to that clip. But I wanted to ask a general question, really linking Endless, your new film, with Ghost Story, and really it is a very general question about your practice. And it's one about structure, it's one about how your work is formed, really. And I've long been impressed, in particular, by the restraint and underlying structure of your time-based and photography practice. And Declan Long, when he wrote a very perceptive text to accompany your new work, Endless, identifies this underlying structure as, he describes it very well, as insistent limitation. However, he also observes that your work, and this is what I felt is a very good sort of description of what I'm trying to talk about, he describes your work as also convulses and overflows, and he talks about how it is skillfully distilled but derived from volatile substances, producing unpredictable effects. And I think this is a very perceptive way of describing this tension that I perceive in your work between the formal structure and yet underlying very powerful emotion. Both forces are very strongly present. And I wondered if you wanted to say something about do you feel that's is that a sort of good description of how you work? Are you conscious of that being an underlying structure within your work?
Yeah, it is something I am conscious of. So I think that is a perceptive remark from Declan. I mean, I suppose in the work, I feel that I'm dealing with some very powerful emotions and also some very powerful and traumatic events that form the backdrop of that. But I'm not really interested in expressionism, if you want, or the idea of artistic expression. So I'm looking to try and do something else with the work, and perhaps this kind of stems from my, as a younger artist, my interest in kind of conceptualism and the kind of formalism that underpins much of that. That the work attempts to use a kind of formal rigor to contain that subject matter in some ways. But I'm also, part of that is also to allow that to become visible in some way, to be expressed. So that tension or that balance between the kind of formal restraint of the work alongside the subject matter and my desire to articulate, as I said earlier, these voices that otherwise don't have a voice, are two very competing and sort of dynamic forces. And so the structure of the work is often designed in a way to allow that to happen. So, for example, I mean, a very kind of clear example is my use of the diptych that I've used in a lot of the photographic works, but also as a structure that underpins a lot of the video-based works, where it's possible to use apparently opposing or contradictory viewpoints or voices or language, and kind of offset these against each other. So that there is something about the work that it's important for me that I kind of create that space formally within the work, where I can have that kind of leakage, if you want, or that there is something there that looks ostensibly and at first impression quite restrained and kind of quite cool, but there's a kind of emotional kind of leakage that happens around it, either through the language or through the voiceover or often through the image itself. So it's that combination, I think, that Declan picks up on. But I mean, I think the work, as I say, in my desire not to have it ostensibly about a kind of artistic expression. So I kind of restrain or withhold that notion of that kind of very easy kind of idea of artistic expression. I mean, my voice is not important in that sense, so I try to create space within the work for other kinds of language, other kinds of voices, other kinds of experience to emerge. And the formal structure of the work is often the means by which I can do that.
Yeah, no, that's marvelous. It's wonderful to have you explain it in that way, because it's just so clear, and certainly it gives so much space for the viewer then to enter and inhabit the space as well. So
hopefully.
I would really have so many questions, but at this point in time, I would like to hear from the audience. Any question from the audience? opportunity you have here. Although we hope that during the exhibition, both Anne and Willie will be physically present here in Modena, hopefully for another talk.
My question is, after this piece of work, Endless, which points towards kind of more use of narration and even maybe some kind of narrative, is this something you would like to explore further in other works? Maybe kind of, I'm thinking of artists like Steve McQueen or Duncan Campbell who have branched out into more conventional narrative film. Is this something you'd like to explore?
Yes and no. I mean, I don't think that I want to make a conventional kind of movie in that sense. I mean, I think I'm more interested in space that this kind of short form film offers, and the flexibility of working within kind of gallery context rather than the kind of longer form of conventional kind of movie. But you know, obviously, it's not something that I'm disinterested in, because I admire so many great filmmakers, including Steve McQueen and Duncan Campbell. But yeah, I think narrative has always been present in some way within my practice, you know, and to some extent storytelling as well. I mean, even the title of the work, Ghost Story, kind of reveals that kind of interest, if you want, or that kind of background to the work. So it's definitely something I want to continue kind of working with. I mean, I in terms of storytelling, and particularly Endless, since you mentioned it, I'm kind of more interested in the kind of ambiguity of stories. You know, the contradictions that storytelling can reveal about a character. So, and that's something that I will explore in a new work that I'm actually making for this show, called Where, which is also the name of the title of the exhibition. So this is a work that I'm currently working on, and will hopefully shoot that in a not too distant future, in and around the border between Derry and Donegal. So yeah, I mean, that work will also have a kind of narrative content, and will also have at least one figure within it. So yeah, I mean, as I said earlier also, I mean, I see this work as a continuum of a number of other works that I've made in the past that have used the human voice, either in voiceover or through text. So I guess I'm not finished with that aspect of the practice yet. And you know, you never know, it could end up being a long form film at some point. At the moment, I'm kind of more interested in the ability to work within kind of short sequences, short bursts, possibly kind of multiple screens. So there's lots to explore in and around all of this, but narrative, I think, remains kind of central to what I'm doing and to the development of the immediate work that I'm going to make, and also work that will happen after that, I'm sure.
Thanks so much.
Vorrei dare la parola a Stefano Pasquini.
Stefano Pasquini, a question. You can now speak.
I want to ask you about the political implications about Brexit. What do you foresee is going to happen to the relationship between the Irish and the British people after Brexit? How do you see the future
between the British and Irish people?
Yes.
I mean, in some ways, Britain and Ireland are very close. I mean, there are obviously a lot of things that divide us and that we disagree about, but there are also many profound connections. And I don't think those will be easily disrupted by Brexit. I mean, but it's hard to quantify or even to kind of underestimate the impact that economic disruption might have on that relationship. I mean, at the moment, Britain and Ireland share a common travel area, which means that even during the pandemic, it is possible for people to travel between Britain and Ireland. You know, Irish people going to Britain will not be subject to the quarantine that's about to be imposed that other European citizens will be subject to. So yeah, it is a very close and complicated and difficult at times relationship, but I think it's one that will survive Brexit. Hopefully, I have to be optimistic.
Thank you, Stefano, for the question. I believe, well, we almost came to the end of our event. We would really love to move forward, but actually it's time for us to say goodbye for this coming soon event. Therefore, I would like to thank all the people who followed this online event. Many people followed us from the UK and Ireland as well. I would like to thank for sure Willie Doherty, wishing him all the success, and we can't wait to see his exhibition and a new video work here in Modena. I would like to thank Anne Stewart for taking part in this conversation and for her very much stimulating questions. Thank you all for being here, and I wish you a great evening.
Thank you, Daniele.
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure to be part of this and to meet your audience virtually. Thank you.
Thank you, Willie. Thank you, Daniele.
Thank you, Anne.